Gatekeeping Part 3, the epic conclusion to the Odyssey. Kind of, at least. Though, this is a bit more of a wrap-up here, I think, because we've already asked ourselves the question, is gatekeeping bad? No, it doesn't seem to be. In fact, it seems to be a good thing, and we were damned stupid to not have done it in the first place. The next question then, of course, was how do we gatekeep? Well, that all comes down to figuring out which people need to be kept out of the hobby, if possible, or at the very least kept out of positions of power, and also how to utterly and one-sidedly reject the narrative that made gatekeeping a bad word in the first place. But these were the things we talked about in the first and the second video. Do go check those out if you haven't already. And now, we are going to look at the consequences of not gatekeeping. Not in terms of the quality of the franchises, we've already explored that both in the first and the second video. There is simply no question that if you do not gatekeep, if you let in the people who aren't actually all that interested in the setting at all, beyond using it as a vehicle to push their own propaganda, then unsurprisingly, the quality is going to suffer. Now, for the sake of recognizable reference, we've mostly been looking at the larger franchises, the Star Wars, the Star Treks, and the Marvels. But you could dig down pretty darn deep into this. BioWare, for example, the PC gaming company. You can pretty much trace the entirety of their downward, seemingly never-ending spiral all the way from Mass Effect 2. After that, the characters get blander, less interesting, and the story even more so. The rare few standouts are the bad ones, like the elf from Dragon Age 2, whose only real remarkable feature is just how ungodly uninteresting and mediocre she is. Though even that might be preferable compared to Vega, the homosexual character that was written as if somebody was standing behind the guy writing him with a gun to his head saying, "You better make him real gay, otherwise my hand might slip." As this giant beefcake-esque character introduces himself to the player by engaging him in a frat school-esque playful boxing fight thing, where you can also choose to just punch him repeatedly in the face. It has got to be one of the most awkward character introductions I have ever experienced in any video game ever. And let us not even speak of Andromeda. Half the characters in that game don't even look human. But again, these are qualitative problems, which I've already demonstrated quite thoroughly, I believe. That point has been hammered home, and the horse is looking much reduced. Instead, what I wanted to talk about here is what happens in a community sense when you don't gatekeep. Because as I've already touched upon on a couple of occasions previously, the outsiders, the SJWs, the fake left, whatever you wish to call them, they have no problems with gatekeeping. They use the words as a wedge to break into our hobbies, into our franchises, by saying, "We're not welcome here, there are bigots, there are whiteists, there are sexists, etc., etc." Which were, of course, terms used to gatekeep. Oh, you're a sexist? Well, Disney, you need to exclude these people from the hobby. Oh, you're a bigot, you need to get out of Warhammer. If you don't agree, you won't be missed. So on and so on. In fact, they absolutely adore gatekeeping, and that's precisely why they've been so goddamn effective at infiltrating these franchises. I'll be using examples from my own various cancellations because, well, I am intimately familiar with them. And there has been a couple attempts launched against me, luckily unsuccessful so far. Somewhat anecdotal to be sure, but with the rate of cancellations these days, I doubt you'll have a hard time finding a corollary. And on the mention of cancel culture as well, therein lies the largest and most blatant difference. Allow me to start with this, just to demonstrate. This is a person on Twitter tagging in PST Norge. That is the Norwegian version of the NSA. The Police's Security Service. This, in all due likelihood, inspired by a certain Reddit, which of course posts stuff like this. Anyway, to use this to get his YouTube banned or report him to Norwegian authorities as a potential terrorist. I mean, by comparison, the usual threats to go after my Patreon or income with accompanying instructions, of course, well, it sounds downright tame, really. I suppose all things truly are relative. And this really is the primary difference. Over the course of the last couple of videos, the last one in particular, I've been talking about how we can use gatekeeping and how we need to be careful to not gatekeep the wrong people. That we need to be able to allow those who have a genuine interest in the hobby to still come in and enjoy it alongside everybody else. We need to have rules, we need to have morals, we need to have standards. This is the main difference between our side and, well, their side. As much as it sounds cliche and painting them out to be nothing but the worst kind of villains, it sounds hyperbolic in fact, but the fact is they do not have standards. They do not have morals. There is absolutely no length they will not go to, and not just that, but they view it as moral to do this. This is a public tweet. This guy thought to himself, this won't get a backlash, this is fine. There's no particular problem with me tweeting something like this. This is entirely okay. Well, it was eventually pointed out to him that what he was doing might very well be quite illegal, and he was sharing it in public, after which it was deleted. But if it weren't for that, there was clearly absolutely no problem with this, right? Now, of course, this is to an extent ridiculous. A national security agency is not going to look at me and go terrorist. It is absurd, and yet it is bandied about in all due seriousness by these people. And let that just sink in for a second. What would somebody have to do to you for you to seriously consider sending not the police after them, but for calling the equivalent of the NSA? And make no mistake, this isn't a mere joke or a meme or anything like that. These people do this. In fact, they're so proud about it, they'll openly post about it afterwards. Like, for example, here. This is an email showing the person who sent a complaint to Games Workshop asking them to try and trademark strike my channel for my old name, Arch Warhammer. A move that Games Workshop would normally never do, and they knew it was so weak that they had to add in their threatening email that they would strike all content on YouTube using Warhammer. Which in all due reality means that I have two options. Either I comply and nothing more happens, or if I tell them to go screw themselves, I have to bring up as evidence every video on YouTube that has Warhammer in it, in the title, in the video, in the channel name, because it's all use of Warhammer on YouTube, and say, why aren't you striking all of these? This is selective, isn't it? Also, you don't seem to be protecting your IP, are you? Games Workshop's only possible recourse at that point would either be to give up or strike literally every Warhammer channel. Talk about putting a gun to somebody's head. Do this, or endanger the entirety of the online community that you belong to. In retrospect, I halfway regret not simply just accepting the proffered torch and beginning the purge. But, well, I am a naive Norwegian. This is, of course, all long in the past now, and it was never much of a credible threat to begin with, simply because, whilst the crazy people like to make me out as all kinds of things, they're sadly somewhat lacking in ammunition. The best they've got is a Chris Rock quote, which, as you can see, the man is clearly a card-carrying member of the KKK. Remarkably wide tent these days, that, but oh well. Or perhaps this. Oh my, oh my. Well, this looks spicy. Real fascism leads to a utopian state. Oh my, well that has it confirmed right there then. Arch is a Nazi. At least so long as you ignore the second line, which was of course very helpfully cut away by people who don't at all have an incredibly dishonest agenda to push, or anything. The point here is, the outsider, as, again, cliched as it sounds, has no standard. They have no morale. There is no depths to which they will not stoop. There are no bad tactics. Hell, I very much so doubt they even think there are a whole lot of bad targets, frankly. And this is absolutely where we are at a disadvantage, and why the situation has degraded as far as it has. Scruples are all well and good. In fact, they are vitally important. But if you're trying to fight somebody who literally has none, they are going to be a weakness. Or, put more eloquently in an old quote, never argue with an idiot because he will drag you down in the mud and beat you with experience. You can't really question that, can you? Another one that is quite interesting here is this one, the paradox of tolerance. This is one often used by the outsider that I made my own version of because, as with most thing the outsider use, they never actually read the source material. And Karl R. Popper is a rather interesting little lad. His ideas on truth and the scientific method in particular are rather fascinating, though even simplifying it would take a while, so I'll skip on over that, though I do recommend you look into it because it is both confusing and deeply interesting at the same time. What Karl R. Popper talked about in his Paradox of Tolerance was not, as the outsider will usually tell you, that you cannot be tolerant towards the intolerant, and therefore we need to censor the bigot, the racist, the sexist, etc. Instead, he said the exact opposite. It truly is remarkable how backwards the outsiders usually do get things. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance, Karl R. Popper said. But I do not imply that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerance. As long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be unwise. But there is a qualifier there. We should claim the right to suppress them with force if they reject the argument, because they may choose to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. A bit outdated to be sure, but it is absolutely true. So long as you can have a discussion, and so long as that is all it is, a free, frank, and open exchange of ideas, there is no need for suppression. In fact, to do so would inherently be unwise and would lead to the rejection of the argument. After all, if you are moving on, as Karl Popper say, to the fist or the pistol, or in the modern age, the blanket ban, the unpersoning, the straight-up deletion of the internet that has happened to people, going after their livelihood, in many cases with modern-day YouTube. That is how you know that one side has stopped arguing and resorted to the most extreme measure within their reach. It absolutely perfectly captures the modern day outsiders, the SJWs, the fake left. They have actively rejected any and all arguments, and they have moved on, universally so, to the most extreme measure they can find. Now, that does include violence. It includes burning, it includes looting, it includes outright murder, but for most of them, it will limit itself to merely unpersoning people, merely taking away their livelihood by striking at their YouTube channel, for example, removing their ability to support themselves via crowdfunding, denying them access to straight-up payment platforms these days. The measures only grow more extreme because they naturally move towards the most extreme option. As Karl R. Popper say, in his case, the most extreme argument is the fist or the pistol. In our modern day, with the internet being what it is, the most extreme argument is almost as bad, though at least slightly less lethal. It is, however, still the most extreme recourse. So let me boil all of this down a little bit, summarize it, and make a more succinct point, yes? And how this relates to gatekeeping, because surely this is a far larger social and political issue, right? I don't actually think it is. See, gatekeeping inherently is an argument. It is a discussion. It is a person saying, hey, can we change this? Because again, remember, change is the near universal part of the outsider's playbook. Then the good gatekeeper says, all right, give me your argument. And if it does indeed contain the usual outsider nonsense, the usual attempt to change a setting for real-life reasons, then it is rejected. We have had this argument. No, you don't get to change our hobby, the hobby that we have created, that we have built, that we have made popular, the hobby that is what it is because of what it is, not despite it. Again, that is an argument I cannot repeat often enough. Star Wars is Star Wars because it is Star Wars. These franchises are popular because of what they are, not despite of it. It is self-evidently true. And so when you make the argument to change it for non-universe reasons, you are not making it more popular, because you are rejecting what makes it good. You are actively trying to make it worse, in fact. And there we have it. We have had the argument, and you are free to have it. You are free to make your own universe if you so choose, but you're not allowed in here. Both for the reasons of basic quality control, of maintaining the setting as I just described, and also for the double reason that the outsider will also inherently, automatically, and unavoidably reject the argument in turn. And I mean that in the most literal sense possible. It simply can be no other way, because they have entered into the franchise with something they consider greater than the franchise and imposed it upon it. They come in and say, hey, change this because of real-life political reasons. They have a greater good. They have an opinion, a belief that is above the setting, and must therefore be enforced upon the setting. Now, you can have opinions that disagrees or goes straight up against a fantasy setting, and that's fine. Again, so long as you don't bring it into the setting, nobody is going to care. But once it is in there, that is the problem. Because now you have a person who has a thing inside the setting that he has forced in there that is more important to him than the quality and the integrity of the setting. And so you cannot, by definition, make any in-setting arguments against him that he will accept, because he has already rejected the setting and placed his own sacred cow, greater good, above it, which must therefore lead to the rejection of the argument. Let me give you a bit more of a figurative example to clarify a bit, because I feel like this is getting a little bit bogged down and confusing, right? let's say you have a setting. It's a futuristic, fancy setting, kind of Star Trek-y. And somebody moves in and says, I want communism in this setting. And everybody, kind of confused, goes like, but there's no point in that. Like, we're a post-scarcity society. We're not communist. We have a state. We have all of these things. There's really no use for your ideology of workers' liberation in a scientific universe where people can press a button and get any food they want. We're kind of beyond the conquest of bread here, but nobody really gatekeeps. After a while, the person is going to start rejecting the in-universe argument because he has a greater goal. His goal is introducing communism into this setting. It is his sacred cow. And therefore, since it is above the setting, it is a greater good, he must reject any in-universe argument. And once that happens, once the argument is rejected, we move to the metaphorical fist and pistol instead, which, as I've already demonstrated, no tactic is too low. In fact, it is not even perceived as low, it is perceived as normal and laudable. At this point, the hobby is already kind of in deep shit, because you didn't keep them out vehemently enough, you didn't argue against them, and so the only counter-argument is a political one. It is to meet them on their own ground because they have already rejected the in-universe argument. Of course, that approach only works until they unilaterally reject that argument as well, but the idea of a modern-day democracy is that we were supposed to have certain protections and rights. Well, that's another problem, isn't it? But now we're moving more into the territory of social media and free expression. The key point here is, if you have to move into the realm of politics to defend your hobby, you've already failed at gatekeeping. You've already let them in, and now you are forced to respond with the same coin because it is the only one that might possibly be accepted. So whilst that is absolutely a necessary tactic to employ now, we would be far better off if we would simply just gatekeep more stringently in the future. And perhaps my hopeful, naive thoughts that we should make clear boundaries and rules so as to not keep certain people who might genuinely be interested out, maybe that is too soft. I hope not, but I guess only time will tell. And as I've mentioned a couple times recently as well, I am becoming a little bit more of an optimist. More and more often, we start seeing backlash and we start seeing the cancel culture the fake left has so diligently grown affecting more and more of their own. When combined with general quote-unquote normie distaste for these things as well, I'm hopeful that in 6 years' time, roundabout so half a decade, we might actually be back to a state where we can actually just gatekeep like normal. And by God, do not forget the time when we did not gatekeep.